To learn more about earning college credits with study hall courses, go to gostudyhall.com or click the link in the description. The 4th of July. Fireworks, hot dogs, and real dogs who just want the big booms to stop already. Many people in the US view the holiday as a way to spend time with family, burn a few sparklers, and commemorate the time we declared our freedom from England. Others choose not to celebrate the 4th of July, and even reflect on the hypocrisy of the phrase, all men are created equal. But boycotting the 4th of July isn't a new trend. On July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass delivered his famous speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." He said, "This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn." In Douglass's speech, he talks about how the holiday is supposed to celebrate independence and civil liberties. But this starts to ring hollow when we look at the US and its complicated history. In 1776, the founders drafted a document that would grant the US independence from England. But the ideas and philosophies that went into that document didn't materialize from thin air. They were inspired by previous thinkers and foundational texts. So no matter what your opinion is about democracy, to understand how we got to where we are as a country, we have to meet some of the guys, because they're always guys, that got credit for writing the ideas that informed governments in every corner of the globe for the last couple centuries. Hi, I'm Chris Vasquez, and this is Study Hall, Power and Politics in US Government. Imagine it's April 1775 in Massachusetts. War just broke out with Britain, and it's not just like a fun April Fool's prank war, it's a real war. The colonists were frustrated by British control over trade and their excessive taxation. In the words of King George III, the colonists were in a state of open and avowed rebellion against the British crown. In an attempt to organize their rebellion, the roughly 20% of colonists who could vote elected 56 delegates into the Second Continental Congress. They were the group of guys that drafted the Declaration of Independence and took over the task of governing throughout the Revolutionary War. Kinda like the Quiet Council of Krakoa in X-Men comics, but with fewer telepaths. After a lot of debate, the signing of the Declaration of Independence marked the first significant step that the original 13 colonies took toward forming a union. The Declaration of Independence, the US Constitution, and the Bill of Rights built much of the framework for the US government, and they're collectively known as the Charters of Freedom. Together, they communicate the ideals that the United States were founded on, for better or worse. But like we said before, the Charters of Freedom didn't just magically spring from a stuffy room in Philadelphia. They were based on several other key documents and ideas that were written centuries earlier. We also want to reiterate that these texts mention rights and freedoms, which sound great and lofty, but they didn't actually belong to the majority of people at the time. When the founders used the word men, like we will throughout the episode, they meant white, property-owning men who were often enslavers. And although there were some exceptions, for the most part, these self-evident rights or freedoms were only available to this select demographic. Not to mention the scholars who studied and wrote about this history, because they've also mostly been white men. That doesn't mean that we can't or shouldn't all try to learn from it, but knowing who has written and shaped history adds context to whose experiences have dominated the mainstream political discourse since the US was founded. That being said, The Pursuit of Happiness isn't just a 2006 film starring Will Smith of Shark Tale fame, so let's take a stroll through history and find out where these ideas came from. Let's go back to another pivotal moment in British history, the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. The Magna Carta was the first official recognition that the written and unwritten laws that other nobles had to follow also applied to the British monarchy. And that's a big deal, because it limited the power and authority of a previously untouchable group. So King John, who signed the Magna Carta, had to acknowledge how his small habit of excessive taxation and illegal imprisonment had actually violated a lot of people's rights. But keep in mind, the Magna Carta was originally intended to just be an agreement between the king and other British nobility. So it basically protected people who were already rich and powerful. In fact, it doesn't really mention the rights of individuals or common folk at all. But the Magna Carta was still important, because it made progress in humbling the monarchy. It also promised to safeguard the liberties of rich people and their stuff. So later, the US government extended that concept by protecting the civil liberties of people more generally, like having the right to freedom of thought, expression, and action, and not having the government infringe on those things. Civil liberties also refer to things like due process, or a fair trial by an unbiased judge and jury. This ideal is mirrored in the 5th and 6th Amendments of the US Constitution, which ensure that all people have the right to due process and a speedy trial with a jury of their peers. Well, there's a little asterisk on that statement. Because yes, that's what it says in the 5th and 6th Amendments, but who that applies to has changed over time. For instance, the fugitive slave laws of 1793 and 1850 denied enslaved people the right to a fair trial, due process, and even their ability to prove whether or not they were free in court. So again, it's important to know the context of who has the power to shape and write about government policies at different times. Back in England, the Magna Carta also brought the concept of habeas corpus into British law, which translates from its original Latin to mean you have the body. Habeas corpus essentially promises rights to those who've been imprisoned or otherwise detained, and says that a person can't be held unlawfully or indefinitely. And it's something we brought over to the US too. Essentially, the Magna Carta is an early example of people with less power banding together to check those above them in the hierarchy. And given the colonists' less than great experiences with King George III, it's understandable that it so heavily inspired the US's own foundational governing documents. Though there is sweet irony in the fact that in our own rebellion from the British Crown, we basically photocopied some of the British governing principles on the way out. So even though the Magna Carta was originally only about rich people, the mythology surrounding the document has evolved to help it become a foundational promise of liberty. It even helped inspire revolutionary democratic legislation like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, over half a millennium later. If we flash forward to a few hundred years after the Magna Carta, we land in the Enlightenment period, which dominated European political thought throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. During this time, philosophical beliefs like religious tolerance, opposition to an absolute monarchy, and individual liberties became popular. The ideas of civil liberties and government protection inspired by the Magna Carta were further developed by people like John Locke, the philosopher, not the character from Lost. His 1689 work was influenced by another theory for how government should function, social contract theory. In Locke's two treatises of government, he pulled from Thomas Hobbes, who was a philosopher and not a tagger from a comic strip. I knew that before filming this episode. His writings focused on individual liberties, natural equality, and the idea that governing power is only legitimate when the people being governed agree to it. Locke's writings also established a system of natural law, where all men are equal and have a God-given right to life, liberty, and property. He said societies form in order to protect these natural rights, where there's a social contract between the people and the government, which basically means that constituents, that's us, give up some liberties in exchange for the benefits of living in a functioning society. And we, the governed, have responsibilities that come along with our rights and protection. Locke argued that we can participate in governance, which today would include voting or holding office. Or we can protest those in power and seek to replace or overthrow them if needed. Locke's views were revolutionary for proposing that people create a government and can recreate it as they choose. This fundamentally challenged the existence of the monarchy and the long-held notion of the divine right of kings, which essentially argued that kings or queens were chosen by God to rule, and therefore shouldn't have to answer to such lowly institutions as parliament or the people. With these newly popular power to the people theories like the Magna Carta and Locke's social contract theory, we can see some of the foundational beliefs about representation and republic governance taking shape. After all, there's a reason why the Constitution starts with "we the people." So all these changes ultimately led to the US creating a new government with these ideals in mind. The dissatisfaction people felt under Britain's thumb escalated throughout the early 18th century, and eventually overflowed into the American Revolution, which was inspired by the overwhelming demand to create a separate US government in the late 1700s. And if you're familiar with US history, you know that this full-blown war was set off partly thanks to something that sounds innocuous: taxes. If you've ever driven in Washington, D.C., you might have noticed their license plates with the phrase "taxation without representation." That's basically the gist of what was happening in the lead up to 1775. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War between Great Britain and France, the British were left severely in debt. To raise some money, they thought it was best to start directly taxing their colonies at a high rate. The colonists, who hadn't been directly taxed up until that point, thought it was absurd to be forced to pay taxes to the king. They felt like it challenged their social status as free men, which is ironic for a bunch of guys who owned other humans, but I digress. For some context, the colonists couldn't elect representatives to the House of Commons, which was the British legislative body in charge of taxation. So the colonists argued that this was an infringement on their rights under a representative government. They were being forced to pay taxes to some king halfway around the world without actually receiving any of the benefits from those taxes. It's almost like if you were to live in Puerto Rico or DC and pay taxes to the federal government without having representation at the federal level. Oh wait. Anyway, the belief that a government should be protecting civil liberties rather than violating them pushed the colonists to declare their intent for independence from the British Crown. AKA, they were ready for war and to create a new government more focused on the people. Now, we know that the discussion of individual liberties was influential throughout the founding of the US government, but it's just as important in society today. There's still a debate about freedom and being able to do whatever you want versus having the protection that comes with living in an organized government and society. Every time you have to take your shoes off at the airport, you're probably thinking, now that's what I call security. But on a serious note, there are still major issues in the way that some rich and powerful people seem to get a slap on the wrist for even the most serious crimes, while the marginalized and poor are disproportionately criminalized and imprisoned. So where do our rights come from? Well, some of them come from a place we wanted so little to do with that we fought an entire war to get away from them. But even when drawing from historical documents, the founders put their own spin on what the country should look like, and how much freedom versus security people should have. It's taken centuries more for those rights to be granted to lots of people who live here, and some rights still haven't been granted. So learning where our rights come from helps us understand the intentions of who came up with them in the first place, how they've shifted, and where we go from here. If you're enjoying Study Hall Power and Politics in US Government and are interested in taking an online course and earning college credit, go to gostudyhall.com or click on the button to learn more. Thanks for watching. See you next time.